A billionaire walks into a Brooklyn cafe and hears a stranger repeat a secret family phrase that no one outside his mansion walls should know. That's the moment everything begins to unravel. Gregory Lancaster, heir to one of New York's largest banking fortunes, is about to discover a hidden truth that could destroy the legacy he's sworn to protect. And the woman behind the counter? She may be far more than just a waitress. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Gregory Lancaster didn't belong in that neighborhood, and he knew it. Wearing a custom Italian suit worth more than the entire cafe's monthly rent, he stepped out of a black car with tinted windows and into the kind of place that smelled like burnt toast and low wages. He wasn't there for the food, God. No, he was hiding, dodging another tabloid scandal involving a supermodel and a private yacht off the Amalfi Coast. He needed obscurity and anonymity, even if it came with chipped mugs and cracked tiles. The cafe was almost empty, save for an old man reading the paper and a tired mother juggling a baby and a laptop. Behind the counter stood a woman with her sleeves rolled up and a ponytail that had clearly survived 3 shifts in a row. Clara Hill didn't flinch when she saw him. She didn't smile either, not that fake, eager smile Gregory was used to from anyone who recognized his last name. Instead, she gave him a polite nod and a simple morning. "What can I get you?" He ordered a black coffee, already regretting his decision to enter this place. Yes, she turned to prepare his drink. Gregory scanned the cafe with mild disdain. The place was decorated with mismatched chairs and faded photographs of people he didn't care about. There was a calm there, a kind of defeated serenity that he had never known. When Clara returned with the coffee and placed it gently in front of him, she said something that made him blink twice. "Careful with that," she said casually. "It'll burn you faster than a Lancaster secret." His world froze. Lancaster secret. That phrase wasn't in the public domain. It wasn't in the newspapers or on blogs. It was something his late father used to say behind closed doors, always with a smirk, always when reminding Gregory that the family name came with fire. He looked up at her face again, really looked this time. Her eyes were sharp, but not hostile. Her voice steady, but not robotic. She didn't seem to realize the weight of what she'd just said. Or maybe she did. He left a generous tip and walked out without saying another word. By the time he reached his penthouse overlooking Central Park, the memory of her voice looped in his mind like a haunting melody. He tried to dismiss it, a fluke, a coincidence. But there was something about her face, the shape of her jaw, the way she held herself. That wasn't just a waitress. That was a riddle, and Gregory hated riddles that he couldn't solve. That he called a private investigator the same night, gave him Clara's name, place of work, and told him to be discreet. Not because he cared for her privacy, but because Lancaster problems needed to be handled in the shadows. No headlines, no loose ends. Clara, meanwhile, didn't need to check over her shoulder to know things had shifted. She'd lived long enough in the quiet corners of the world to feel when the air got heavier. It wasn't the first time someone tried to dig into her past, but it was the first time it came from someone who could actually find something. Still, she stayed calm. She worked her shifts, paid her rent, cooked her own meals. She didn't flinch when the cafe owner told her someone called asking for her employment records. "Must be a credit thing," she said with a smile, but it wasn't. Gregory's investigator was thorough, and within days, he unearthed something strange. An old record from a defunct law firm once retained by the Lancaster family. In a storage facility filled with dusty boxes and forgotten ledgers, there was a note clipped to a birth certificate, one belonging to a child born to Esther Hill, a Haitian immigrant who had once been a nanny in the Lancaster estate. The note was handwritten by Henry Lancaster himself, Gregory's father. It read, "She has my mother's eyes." Gregory read the note 3 times. Each time, his stomach knotted tighter. His father, the ruthless, disciplined patriarch of the Lancaster Empire, had left behind more than assets and enemies. He had left behind a daughter, one with the same blood, the same name, only without the privileges, without the seat at the table. Gregory's face turned pale with fury. This wasn't just a threat to his inheritance. It was a personal insult. The idea that a waitress, someone who poured coffee for minimum wage, could be his half-sister was almost unbearable. Worse that, his father had hidden it, lied, betrayed the legacy. But if Clara Hill was truly a Lancaster, then everything Gregory believed about order, control, and bloodlines would start to crumble. And that, more than anything, was unacceptable. He poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against crystal, and stared out at the skyline. The city below blinked in indifferent lights, unaware that a storm had begun. Gregory didn't know what Clara wanted. Money? Recognition? Revenge? Whatever it was, he'd find out. And then, like every other problem in his life, he would eliminate it, surgically, quietly, and without remorse. But he had underestimated Clara, because Clara already knew who she was. She had always known. Gregory didn't wait. The next morning, he stormed into the office of Carter and Blake, the old family legal firm, with the same energy he used to close billion-dollar deals. He didn't bother with small talk. He demanded records, names, answers. Most of the senior partners were gone or dead, but one remained. Malcolm Blake, retired and nearing 80, thin as a pencil and sharp as ever. The two men sat in a dim room filled with leather chairs and the smell of old paper. Gregory placed the birth record and handwritten note on the table like evidence in a trial. Malcolm studied it, sighed, and said, "So you found it." Blake didn't deny it. He didn't stall. He looked Gregory straight in the eye and confirmed what the younger man feared. Henry Lancaster had a daughter out of wedlock. Her mother, Esther Hill, had worked for the family for a decade before being quietly dismissed while pregnant. Gregory's father struck a private agreement. The child would carry a different name, receive no claim, and, above all, never approach the Lancaster family. It was honor-bound. Signed. Forgotten. Gregory's hands clenched. He asked why this wasn't revealed sooner, why such a betrayal had been allowed to grow in the dark. Malcolm shrugged and said, "Your father believed in containment. He thought he could seal truth in a vault. But truth is like rot. It spreads." Gregory stood up, unable to sit any longer. His thoughts spiraled. Press leaks, boardrooms, inheritance clauses. He wasn't angry at Clara. He was furious at his father. That was the real rupture. Henry had introduced chaos into a dynasty, built on control. While Gregory plotted damage control, Clara felt the heat closing in. Former employers were called. Her landlord was questioned. A man in a sedan watched her apartment for 2 days straight. But she didn't break stride. Clara knew this was inevitable. Her mother had told her stories, half-myths about a mansion, about a man with gray eyes and a cold voice. She never cared for the wealth. She only wanted the truth to stand one day without shame or fear. She had not expected it to come this soon, but now that it had, she faced it head-on. Gregory's next step was more calculated. He summoned his legal team and retrieved his father's will, now archived in a downtown Manhattan vault. To his horror, the original copy, legally notarized, signed 6 months before Henry's death, contained a new clause. 50% of the Lancaster estate, investments, and holdings were to be allocated to one Clara Hill, daughter of Esther. The clause was irrevocable and, worse, included a condition. If Clara publicly acknowledged her lineage, the inheritance would trigger automatically, and Gregory would be legally prohibited from contesting it. The penmanship was undeniably Henry's. The implications were catastrophic. Gregory felt as if a knife had slid between his ribs. He'd fought rivals, sued conglomerates, survived PR disasters. But this was intimate. This was war within the bloodline. His instincts screamed to crush it before it took root. But he couldn't use force, not yet. Clara was too invisible, too grounded. If he attacked her overtly, the media might side with her. Instead, he chose humiliation. She didn't understand the world she was stepping into, so he would let her in, just enough to make her drown. The invitation arrived 2 days later, elegant cardstock with the Lancaster crest. A benefit gala at the Met, hosted by Gregory himself. Clara received it while folding laundry in her cramped apartment. She recognized the bait instantly, but accepted it anyway. She had no fancy dress, no stylist. She bought a simple navy gown from a clearance rack and wore shoes with worn soles. On the night of the event, she took the subway. Gregory spotted her as soon as she entered. Heads turned, not because of glamour, but because of the dissonance. She didn't fit the chandelier glow, the wine whispers, the velvet etiquette. Gregory greeted her with a polite smirk and introduced her to the crowd as a long-lost family acquaintance. The message was clear. Keep her close. Keep her powerless. The room played along. A cousin asked if she was with the caterers. A family friend muttered that she looked like a housekeeper who'd taken a wrong turn. But Clara stood straight, her back stiff, her eyes never wavering. During dinner, the cruelty escalated. An elderly aunt leaned toward Clara and mused aloud. You know, dear, we've always been generous with the help. Perhaps you misread kindness for kinship. There was light laughter at the table. Clara set down her fork, folded her napkin, thanked the host for the evening, and stood to leave. Gregory thought she would crumble, that she would storm out humiliated or cause a scene. But she didn't. She walked with grace, shoulders back, steps evened out on her way out. She passed a frail woman seated near the entrance. The woman looked up, met Clara's gaze, and whispered, "You have his eyes." It was Margaret Lancaster, Gregory's mother. No cameras caught the moment, but Gregory saw it. His mother hadn't spoken publicly in years. And yet, for Clara, she did. The next morning, the tabloids buzzed with confusion. Social pages posted photos of the mystery woman at the Lancaster Gala. Speculation began. Who was she? A lost cousin? A scandalous affair? Nothing concrete emerged, but curiosity grew. For the first time, Gregory lost control of the narrative. He slammed his laptop shut in frustration. Clara, meanwhile, visited her mother's grave for the first time in over a year. She brought flowers. She sat. She spoke softly, not as if mourning, but as if finally sharing something sacred. "I said it," she whispered, and he heard it. She stayed until the sun dipped behind the trees, then walked away lighter. Even as storms gathered, Gregory met with his lawyers again that week, this time to explore options to overturn the will. They found no legal cracks. Henry had been lucid, the documents clean, so Gregory changed tactics. He filed a motion claiming emotional manipulation, suggesting Clara had somehow coerced a dying man. It was weak, desperate, but it bought time. Across town, Clara received a visit from a stranger, Tom Reynolds, an old attorney with no ties to the Lancasters. He offered nothing up front, just a folder and a single statement. "This fight won't be fair, but it can still be right." Inside the folder were letters. Henry's letters. Signed. Personal. They confirmed what Clara already knew. But now, she had proof, and the world would soon know it too. Clara wasn't naive. She knew the invitation was a trap before she even opened the envelope. Gregory Lancaster wanted a show, and she was the bait. Still, she went. Not for him, not for his guests, but because this was the moment she would step into the same space her mother had been banished from decades ago. The gala was a spectacle: chandeliers, string quartets, curated art, and curated people, each playing their role in a performance designed to enforce hierarchy. Clara, in a modest navy dress and shoes that whispered rather than clicked, didn't flinch when the stares began. She saw it all: the smirks behind champagne flutes, the raised brows, the tilted heads. But she'd been looked at like that before. She'd simply never stood still long enough for the judgment to matter. Gregory welcomed her with the smile of a serpent. "Clara Hill," he said, as if introducing a circus act, "a family acquaintance." The words drew polite laughter, the kind meant to slice rather than amuse. Clara nodded, neither challenging nor retreating. She knew the games of the rich: exclusion disguised as politeness, disdain dressed in pearls. But what they didn't know, what Gregory hadn't considered, was that Clara had walked through far darker halls than these. The room was gilded, yes, but full of ghosts. Dinner was the real arena. Gregory had arranged the seating so Clara sat at the far end, among second cousins and spouses of forgotten board members. She listened silently as stories of European villas and tax shelters swirled around her. Then came the moment Gregory had staged: a planted insult, cloaked in condescension. An elderly aunt, leathery and diamond-clad, leaned over and said, "We've always been generous with the help. Perhaps you mistook kindness for kinship." The table chuckled, knives clinked. On porcelain, Clara didn't blink. She set down her fork with care, folded her napkin, rose to her feet, and said, "Thank you for the evening." No one stopped her. No one expected her to leave with her head high and her silence intact. But she did, and as she crossed the marble foyer, an old woman in a wheelchair reached out. Margaret Lancaster, Gregory's mother, hadn't spoken publicly in years. But now, her voice, frail and unshaken, whispered, "You have his eyes." It wasn't loud, but Gregory heard it. That one phrase, spoken by the only person still feared in the Lancaster family, cracked something deep inside him. He covered it quickly with forced laughter, but his hand trembled as he raised his glass. The next morning, Clara's name was on every gossip site. Not by design, not from any statement, but from a viral video of the gala where she simply existed. The internet did what the press would not. It questioned, who was she? Why was she there? And why did Gregory Lancaster look like he'd seen a ghost? Clara didn't read the articles. She didn't care for the noise. Instead, she took a bus to the cemetery, carrying flowers wrapped in newspaper. She sat by her mother's grave for hours, speaking little, mostly thinking. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she was about to do, not just stepping into a name, but dismantling an empire that had tried to forget her. She wasn't after fortune. She wanted a record corrected. A truth declared, Gregory. Now rattled, doubled down. He filed for a legal injunction, claiming emotional manipulation, suggesting Clara had somehow exploited a vulnerable old man for gain. It was a stretch, and he knew it. But he had money, lawyers, connections. And for the first time, those things weren't moving fast enough. The judge didn't throw out his petition, but neither did he grant it. The case would proceed. That was a loss, and Gregory felt it like poison in his veins. In the midst of this, Clara received another knock at her door. Tom Reynolds. He introduced himself as a retired attorney, once feared, now forgotten, but still sharp where it counted. He'd heard about her case through old colleagues. He brought no promises, only an offer. He would help, not for money, for justice. Clara, after a pause, let him in. Tom began to build the case not just with facts but with history. He unearthed letters, financial ledgers, witness accounts from the old Lancaster household. Most damning of all were the handwritten notes from Henry himself, affirming Clara as his daughter, expressing regret, acknowledging the silence as his greatest cowardice. They weren't sentimental. They were precise, legal, unshakable. As this mountain of evidence grew, so did public interest. The media began to shift. Business journalists, not gossip writers, started covering the case. Stock analysts began asking if the Lancaster empire was stable. Board members whispered behind Gregory's back. Shareholders demanded clarity. It wasn't just family drama anymore. It was financial liability. Clara remained out of the spotlight. She declined interviews. She still worked at the cafe, though she knew it wouldn't last. Strangers began recognizing her. Some offered sympathy. Others offered suspicion. She met them all with calm. She had no script, only clarity. One night, as she wiped down a counter, a man in a suit offered to buy her silence. She refused before he finished speaking. Gregory, watching his fortress crack, grew desperate. He tried to paint Clara as unstable, dredging up a sealed juvenile case from her teenage years. It backfired. The court sealed it again, citing irrelevance and bad faith. Then he tried to settle, a quiet, generous payout in exchange for walking away. Clara refused. Her words to her lawyer were simple. If I leave now, it'll be as if I never existed. The court date was set. For the first time in decades, the Lancaster name would appear in a courtroom not as plaintiff or benefactor, but as defendant. Gregory stood to lose not just money, but the illusion of purity he'd inherited and defended with every ounce of his being. Clara stood to gain recognition, but more importantly, she stood to undo a silence that had been bought and enforced for 30 years. Tom prepared her without sentimentality. You will be questioned, attacked, undermined, but the truth is on your side. That doesn't always mean you win, but it means you stand. And so she did. Clara sat in the hallway of the courthouse, her back straight, her hands folded neatly on her lap. No makeup, no dramatics, just presence. Around her, reporters murmured, cameras flashed, and courthouse staff moved quickly, pretending not to gawk. She wasn't dressed like someone fighting for millions. She wore a simple black coat, slacks, and flats. Meanwhile, Gregory arrived like a general entering battle, flanked by lawyers, stylists, and PR handlers. He wore a three-piece suit, darker than coal, tailored to precision. He looked confident, but his jaw clenched tighter than usual, and beneath the facade, something in his eyes betrayed the tension he couldn't suppress. The courtroom itself was clinical and impersonal, but the case was anything but. Tom Reynolds, calm and composed, opened by presenting the facts: a legally binding will, a series of signed letters from Henry Lancaster affirming Clara's paternity, and a set of household testimonies from former staff. The documents were clear. Clara Hill was not an imposter or opportunist. She was Henry's daughter, born of silence, raised in shadows, but legitimate in the eyes of law. Gregory's legal team struck back with everything they had. They painted Clara as a schemer, someone who had appeared conveniently after Henry's death, armed with selective memories and manipulated letters. They questioned the chain of custody for the documents, implied misconduct, and tried to chip away at the credibility of each witness. But they didn't account for the precision of Tom's preparation. Each accusation was calmly dismantled, each document authenticated, each witness unwavering. Gregory watched the momentum slip, and for the first time in years, he was not in control of the outcome. Then came the turning point. A surprise witness, an elderly man named Albert Donnelly, a former financial advisor to the Lancaster estate, long believed to be deceased, appeared to testify. He walked with a cane and spoke slowly but firmly. He told the court that Henry had often spoken of his regret regarding the daughter he left behind. He recalled a specific afternoon, 2 years before Henry's death, when Henry handed him a folder and said, "If something happens to me before I fix this, make sure she gets what's hers." That folder was the same one now being examined by the court: letters, photographs, a DNA test ordered privately. The court fell silent. Gregory, cornered, made a critical error. He asked to address the court himself, a move no lawyer recommended. His voice was steady but venomous. "The Lancaster name means something," he said. "It was earned through discipline, control, structure. This woman, I don't care what blood test says what, she doesn't belong in this family. She wasn't raised in it. She wasn't forged by it. You don't get to walk in and claim half the legacy because of biology. That's not justice. That's theft." He sat down, proud, but he hadn't seen the judge's face as he spoke, or the reaction from the jury. His speech didn't win respect. It revealed fear. The judge called for recess. Outside, the media spun Gregory's words into headlines. Phrases like elitist tirade and DNA doesn't lie, but arrogance speaks louder trended across networks. In contrast, photos of Clara sitting quietly beside Tom, listening attentively, circulated like wildfire. She became a symbol, not just of a hidden heiress, but of quiet endurance. People saw themselves in her more than they ever did in Gregory. Behind the scenes, the pressure mounted. Gregory's board of directors at Lancaster Holdings called for an emergency meeting. Investors, already jittery from months of bad press, now faced the potential of shareholder lawsuits if the company appeared to be involved in suppressing a legal heir. The brand, once synonymous with power, now risked becoming synonymous with scandal. The consequences extended beyond Gregory. People began to see Clara not as a threat, but as a solution, someone who could bring calm and clarity where Gregory had brought only fire. Back in the courtroom, the defense tried one last desperate tactic. They called a forensic psychologist to suggest that Henry Lancaster may have been suffering from cognitive decline when he amended his will. But Tom had anticipated this. He presented medical records, dated within weeks of the will's signing, from a renowned neurologist confirming Henry's mental clarity. The judge asked one question: did Henry Lancaster express intent to include Clara Hill in his estate? The neurologist answered, yes. He stated she was his only regret and his final duty. With that, the floor belonged to Clara. She had not spoken once since the trial began. Now, she stood, took the witness seat, and looked straight ahead. Her voice didn't tremble. "I didn't come here to take anything," she said. "I came to acknowledge what was always true. My mother raised me without bitterness, without asking for a cent. She told me I was enough as I was. But the truth matters. Not because of the money, because I exist. Because we all deserve to be seen." There were no tears, no dramatic pauses, just a truth so clear it didn't need decoration. The judge adjourned. 3 days later, the verdict was delivered. Clara Hill was declared the legal daughter of Henry Lancaster. The will was upheld in full. Half of the Lancaster estate would transfer to her, Without delay, Gregory's petition was dismissed with prejudice. In addition, the court launched a separate inquiry into whether Gregory had attempted to tamper with witnesses during the pretrial phase. The gavel fell, and with it, Gregory Lancaster's illusion of invincibility shattered. Outside, Clara didn't speak to reporters. She walked straight to the sidewalk, thanked Tom with a nod, and got into a taxi. No entourage, no champagne, just a quiet ride home. Gregory, now officially stripped of his title as company head, faced his board with a forced smile and a resignation letter already drafted. The empire his father built didn't collapse, but the balance shifted, and the world saw, perhaps for the first time, that truth could wear simple clothes and still stand taller than legacy. Gregory Lancaster had spent his life believing there were two kinds of people, those who built dynasties and those who served them. That belief was the cornerstone of every business deal he'd made, every room he'd dominated, every lie he'd told himself. But when the court declared Clara Hill the rightful heir to half of the Lancaster estate, that foundation split beneath him like ice under pressure. The humiliation was not just public, it was existential. He didn't lose to a rival billionaire or a hostile board. He lost to a woman who had never asked for the throne. And that, to Gregory, was worse than defeat. It was irrelevance. The backlash hit fast. Shareholders demanded answers, not just about the trial, but about the years Gregory had spent burying internal scandals. Investigators, once held at bay by fear of his power, now circled like vultures. Internal memos leaked. An email chain between Gregory and a now terminated executive revealed attempts to discredit Clara before the will ever went public. The board acted swiftly, and Gregory was removed by unanimous vote. Officially, they cited conduct unbecoming of an executive. Off the record, it was simpler. The brand couldn't survive with him at the helm. Clara, meanwhile, rejected every offer of power. She declined seats on boards, turned down speaking invitations, and returned to her apartment with the same quiet determination she'd always carried. But she couldn't return to anonymity. Her name was now etched into the narrative of a corporate dynasty, and people, strangers, journalists, activists, wanted her to become something symbolic. But Clara wasn't interested in symbols. She wanted peace. She moved out of the city quietly, finding a modest home near the Jersey coast, far from cameras and expectations. Tom Reynolds sent her one final letter, a copy of the court's decision and a note that read, "Now you know." She didn't frame it. She put it in a wooden box and slid it under her bed. There would be no victory parade, no memoir, just the soft rhythm of waves and the silence she had earned. The cafe where she once worked closed shortly after the trial. The owner retired and moved to Florida. Clara stopped by once before it shut down, sat in her old spot, and drank a final cup of coffee alone. She left a tip and bills so crisp they looked untouched. For Gregory, the fall was slower, more painful. The empire didn't crumble, but the walls closed in. Invitations dried up. Partners cut ties. He began selling assets, not for liquidity, but for legal fees and silence. There were rumors of bankruptcy, of exile, of breakdowns in luxury rehab centers. None were fully confirmed, but the image of Gregory Lancaster, titan of finance, reduced to a headline in the back of a newspaper, became a punchline in circles that once revered him. He moved out of his penthouse, trading chandeliers for anonymity. A man who once couldn't walk down Wall Street without being greeted by name now wore baseball caps and sunglasses to go unnoticed. What stung most wasn't the financial loss. It was that the world moved on. Clara's name faded from the front pages as the next scandal took center stage. Gregory, desperate to reclaim some piece of relevance, tried to launch a new venture. It failed within months. Investors didn't forget, and the public didn't forgive. The Lancaster name, once ironclad, now carried a footnote, and it wasn't his. Clara spent her days reading, walking by the shore, and writing letters she rarely mailed. Occasionally, she received visitors from old lives, a fellow waitress, a childhood neighbor, a librarian who once gave her extra minutes after closing. They didn't ask about the trial. They didn't need to. They saw she was the same woman, just quieter, steadier. Once, a boy recognized her from a news segment, shown in his high school civics class. She smiled, asked his name, and told him, "Keep studying." Then she moved on, as if the moment hadn't happened. Gregory, for all his calculations, had never understood legacy. He thought it was something inherited, protected by lawyers and vaults. But Clara showed the world something else. That legacy could be reclaimed, not by conquest, but by standing still and refusing to be erased. And that terrified him, because he realized too late that all his power had been borrowed, not earned. And now the lenders were gone. One evening, he saw her on television again, a re-airing of the trial, followed by a quiet documentary someone had made without her participation. She appeared only briefly, always in stillness. The narrator said, "She never asked for justice to be televised. She just wanted it done." Gregory turned off the screen and sat in the dark. No drink, no company, no noise. Clara stood in her small garden that same evening, tending to lavender she'd planted weeks before. A neighbor waved from across the yard. She waved back. Nothing dramatic, nothing newsworthy, just life, unburdened, unbranded, and fully hers. Clara didn't celebrate the verdict. There were no parties, no press conferences, no victory tours. Instead, she packed a single suitcase, left the city quietly, and moved into a modest coastal cottage in New Jersey that she rented under her mother's surname. The house was plain: 2 bedrooms, a narrow porch, and a creaky screen door that whined in the wind. She chose it not for the aesthetics, but for the view. The ocean just beyond the backyard, eternal and indifferent. There, she could hear herself think. The storm had passed, and what remained was silence, not relief. The legal recognition changed everything on paper, but Clara's life remained simple. The money from the inheritance sat untouched in accounts she barely logged into. She wasn't interested in investments or luxury or status. She spent her days walking along the beach, tending to her small herb garden, and writing letters, some to her mother, some to no one. She didn't send most of them. They were for herself, a way to drain the thoughts that still lingered like shadows in corners she hadn't yet lit. Gregory, on the other hand, was unrecognizable. Without the Lancaster name opening doors and silencing dissent, he was just another man in a city that no longer cared who he was. He moved into a smaller apartment, sold off rare art and vintage watches, and severed ties with lawyers who had once treated him like royalty. No one returned his calls. The people who had built empires alongside him now declined meetings, canceled lunches, and rerouted invitations. He wandered through days in anonymity, sometimes walking past buildings he once owned, now occupied by strangers who didn't look twice. It wasn't scandal that ruined him. It was irrelevance. One afternoon, he slipped on a step inside his apartment and sprained his wrist. He took a cab to a public hospital where the receptionist asked if anyone should be contacted. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I'm fine." They treated him like anyone else, efficiently, without reverence. That stung more than any headline ever had. Gregory had once believed pain was weakness. Now he understood that real pain was being forgotten. Tom Reynolds sent Clara one last letter. He'd retired for good, moving to a farmhouse upstate with no Wi-Fi and a stubborn mule named Charlie. His letter was short, a photocopy of the court's final stamped decision and a single line written in cursive ink. "You were always enough." Clara read it once, smiled faintly, and tucked it into the same wooden box beneath her bed. The box was never locked. It didn't need to be. Its contents were no longer secrets. They were scars that had healed into quiet truths. The cafe, where Clara used to work, officially closed, but she visited it one last time. The windows were boarded up, the sign half faded. She found her old seat at the counter, brushed off the dust, and sat for a minute. A teenager passed by and stopped. He recognized her from a school project about famous trials. "You're her, right?" he asked. She nodded. "What was it like?" She paused, then said, "Tiring, but worth it." He thanked her, and she watched him walk off, his backpack too heavy for his frame. She left a $5 bill folded under a cracked coaster before stepping back into the sun. She became Mrs. Hill to her new neighbors, polite, private, pleasant. They didn't know the full story, only pieces, that she had come from the city, that she didn't talk much about family, and that she read a lot. Some guessed she'd been a teacher, others thought she was an artist. No one asked directly, and Clara was grateful for that. She didn't want to be a legend. She wanted to be ordinary. Back in Manhattan, the Lancaster name lingered like dust in corners of power. The company stabilized under new leadership, investors returned, and quarterly reports began showing growth again. But the aura of untouchability was gone. People whispered about the trial in boardrooms. Caution replaced confidence. And Gregory? He became a warning, a case study, a whispered "don't end up like him." He stopped trying to reclaim anything. He started borrowing mystery novels from a public library where no one knew his face. He saw Clara once, from a distance, on a weekend trip to the coast. She was walking out of a bakery, holding a brown paper bag, her hair tied back, no entourage in sight. He stayed across the street, frozen in place. She didn't see him, or if she did, she didn't let it show. She got in her car and drove off, music playing softly through open windows. Gregory stood there long after she left, not sure if what he felt was envy, sorrow, or something too tangled to name. Clara returned home, set the bag on her counter, and put on a kettle. She didn't think about Gregory. She didn't wonder about revenge or reconciliation. She simply sat on her porch with a cup of tea and watched the sea. Her dog, a rescue with more heart than coordination, lay at her feet, twitching in dreams. The phone rang once inside. She let it ring. The breeze carried lavender and salt, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she owed anything to anyone. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't closure, but it was peace. And that was enough. The Lancaster scandal vanished from the headlines as quickly as it had erupted. In a world addicted to newer stories and louder crises, even the tale of a disinherited billionaire and a hidden daughter was eventually replaced. A politician's downfall, a celebrity's relapse, a market crash. Each news cycle pushed Clara further into the background. But in certain corners of Manhattan's elite, the whispers remained. Over glasses of aged whiskey and inside private lounges, the story was retold like a modern fable, reshaped with each retelling. They called her the waitress who broke a dynasty, the bastard who didn't blink, the girl with the quiet eyes, and louder truth. None of them truly knew her, and that was how Clara preferred it. Gregory tried to adapt, but the world had changed too quickly for him to catch up. His attempts at rebuilding were met with silence or scorn. Every venture collapsed, under the weight of his name. He'd once believed reputation was armor. Now he saw it could become a target. He spent his days in borrowed apartments and anonymous cafes, places where no one asked questions and no one cared about answers. He read books without purpose, stared at blank pages, and wondered when exactly the fire had left him. He no longer spoke about the trial, not even to himself. It had become too real to analyze and too surreal to accept. Clara visited the grave of Henry Lancaster just once. She brought no flowers, only a worn photograph of her and her mother, taken in front of a mirror with a cracked corner. She stood silently for several minutes, placed the photo at the base of the stone, and whispered, "You were wrong to hide me, but I lived anyway." Then she walked away without looking back. No one saw her. No one needed to. It wasn't a gesture for the world. It was the end of a conversation she had waited 30 years to finish. Her life in New Jersey settled into a rhythm defined by small rituals and quiet acts of kindness. She helped an elderly neighbor repaint a porch. She dropped groceries at the door of a young couple with a newborn. She became a familiar presence at the local library, where she read more than she spoke. Those who knew her never pried. They sensed a story but respected the silence wrapped around it. To them, she was just Clara Hill, soft-spoken and steady. The kind of person who listened more than she answered and left places better than she found them. One afternoon, as she left the post office, a man approached her cautiously. He introduced himself as a journalist who had covered her case early on. He wasn't looking for a quote. He just wanted to say thank you. "You reminded people that legacy isn't just money," he said. She smiled, not to acknowledge the compliment, but to release him from the moment. He nodded and walked away. Clara didn't tell him that she didn't want to remind anyone of anything. She hadn't acted for justice or reform or legacy. She acted because the lie had become unbearable. And now that the lie was gone, she simply wanted to exist. Gregory's name faded from conference invitations and Forbes lists. His assets dwindled. His alliances dissolved. He spent more time in libraries than boardrooms, occasionally scribbling thoughts into notebooks he never finished. Once, he mailed Clara a letter, and signed, filled with unspoken apologies. She never responded. She didn't tear it up either. She just placed it inside the wooden box under her bed, beside the court papers and the final note from Tom. Some things didn't need answers. Some endings were quiet by necessity, not failure. That a real estate investor tried to contact Clara's attorney to offer a lucrative deal on her inherited Lancaster shares. The answer came back in a single sentence: she's not interested. The offer wasn't repeated. The market assumed she would eventually sell or cash out, but she never did. The assets sat untouched, legally hers, but not defining her. In a world where identity was currency, Clara refused to be spent. Seasons changed. New developments replaced old buildings. Wall Street rose and dipped. Faces came and went. But on a stretch of coastline where the houses were plain and the winds always moving, Clara kept to her rhythm. She drank her coffee at dawn, walked her dog through streets that didn't care about legacies, and wrote letters that didn't need replies. She had no hunger for reinvention. She'd been both ghost and storm. Now she chose stillness. The town eventually stopped seeing her as someone with a past. They saw her as someone who showed up. For meetings, for small favors, for moments that didn't need drama to matter. She spoke at the local school once, at the principal's request, not about money or trials, but about finding peace after storms. Sometimes, she told the students, the hardest thing isn't fighting. It's choosing to stop. That night, she sat on her porch with a book she didn't read and watched the horizon turn gold. The ocean whispered no secrets. And for the first time in her life, neither did she. The day was overcast, the kind that made the world feel quieter, wrapped in soft shadows and slow movements. Gregory Lancaster slipped in his apartment's kitchen and landed hard against the cold tile. Nothing broke, just a bruised hip and a bruised silence. He sat there for a long time before calling for help, not because of pain, but because of the realization that no one would be calling him. At the hospital, a nurse asked if there was someone she should notify. He gave her a tight smile and said no. She didn't press. The room was white and sterile, filled with sounds of distant footsteps and humming machines. He felt the absence of everything that used to follow his name. Clara never heard about the fall. She wouldn't have reached out if she had. There was no hatred, no revenge left. Just distance, grown not from bitterness but from understanding. That some divides aren't meant to be crossed, only accepted. She still received mail addressed to Miss Lancaster from time to time, mostly from financial institutions, some from strangers who had followed the trial years ago. She never corrected the name, but she never used it either. Clara Hill was who she had always been, long before courts or wills gave her anything else. She spent more time in her garden now. The lavender had taken root, stronger than she expected. Her dog, older and slower, liked to nap in patches of sunlight. On Sundays, she walked to the small church on the corner, always arriving just after the hymns and leaving before the last prayer. No one asked why. They just learned to smile and wave as she passed. She preferred it that way. Words had carried weight in her life, too much weight for too long. Now, she chose quiet as her answer to most things. Inside her home, the wooden box remained under her bed. The documents, the letters, even the faded photograph she had left at her father's grave, all remained untouched. She hadn't opened it in months. She didn't need to. What she had needed to prove was done, and what remained was memory, not motive. She still wrote letters occasionally, but fewer than before. Some ended mid-sentence. Some began with names and drifted into silence. She never reread them. They were not for closure. They were simply a way to keep herself from disappearing entirely into the world's forgetfulness. One afternoon, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a leather-bound book with no note, no explanation. Tucked between the pages was a bookmark, an old business card from Lancaster Holdings. She stared at it for a moment, then closed the book and placed it on a shelf, not out of curiosity, but as acknowledgement. Some people say goodbye without using words. She understood that now, and she didn't need to open the book to hear what had been left unsaid. The years passed gently. The town grew, reshaped by new families, new houses, new hands. Clara stayed, not as a figure of local legend, but as a neighbor who helped quietly, whose story people stopped telling because it had long since stopped needing an ending. One boy she'd once met on the street, the same who had recognized her from television, grew up and became a teacher at the local high school. They occasionally passed each other at the grocery store. He always said hello with a kind of reverence. He couldn't hide, and she always smiled with the kind of grace that didn't need correcting. That on the last day of summer, Clara walked into her garden just after sunrise. The light was soft, the sky cloudless. She knelt beside the lavender, now in full bloom, and trimmed a handful for the kitchen table. Her dog lay nearby, watching with sleepy eyes. A breeze passed, carrying the scent of salt and soil. The phone rang once inside. She didn't move to answer it. The sound faded. The moment didn't. Clara stood, holding the cut stems in one hand, and looked toward the sea. She didn't think of the trial, or the fortune, or the name that had nearly swallowed her. She didn't think of what she'd lost or gained. She just breathed, and in that breath lived the shape of her whole journey. Unspoken, unperformed, but fully known. There was no audience left to applaud, no enemy left to defy. Only a life, intact, unpolished, real, and that, quietly, was everything.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.